Hi, everybody. It's great having these press awards given out on the night when we are about to hear from a wonderful journalist who has also won several awards during her journalism career of 20 years. Ellen Meacham is a professor at Ole Miss, the University of Mississippi, and she has her master's in Southern Studies, which helped a lot to aid her in the research that she has done over 11 years on this book that she has out now, the Delta Epiphany, Robert F. Kennedy in Mississippi. I looked at some of the reviews of Ellen's book, and I was about to call her a dogged reporter, but her editor at the Post-Courier in South Carolina, when she was working there, instead called her a compassionate bulldog. And then when I was talking to her earlier, he said, I thought you were just a nice lady from the South, but actually you're a shark. And she has been able to dig up lots of wonderful things that illustrate this very complex time back in the 60s, when the world was just beginning, and this country was really just beginning to explore civil rights in the South after Reconstruction had failed 100 years before. And the South was a difficult place for Black Americans, African Americans. And Bobby Kennedy from Massachusetts decided he wanted to see what was going on because they were fighting poverty. And he heard that the Mississippi Delta was a place of extraordinary poverty. And he came down to the Delta. And Ellen is going to tell you what he found and how it changed his life, how it changed the times, and how we need to focus on it now as we continue our fight for civil rights in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And I'm so grateful, so thankful to Nicola and everybody here at the Sixth Floor Museum. What an amazing facility, and what a beautiful way that you tell the story both of the events here in Dallas in 1963 and the context of it, as well as today's exhibit, which is such an important part of the ongoing struggle that, as she referenced, the United States in making progress on some of the biggest challenges that we faced as a nation. I'm so thankful to be here for several reasons, and it's very appropriate that we're here in the exhibit with Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King, because there's kind of a through line that here in Dallas is just kind of a crucible of events that affected this story that I'm about to tell, even though it's set in the Mississippi Delta. When Robert Kennedy, and so there are several interesting connections, when Robert Kennedy was Attorney General for his brother, and when Jack Kennedy was president, at his last cabinet meeting before he was assassinated, before he headed to Texas, he made notes in the margin and wrote poverty, poverty, poverty about 6 times and circled it, and had asked one of his aides to develop a plan for his second term and for his re-election campaign, looking at the issue of poverty. And then, of course, we know what happened, sadly, after that. But after the funeral, and as Mrs. Kennedy was moving out of the White House, she gave her brother-in-law, Robert Kennedy, those notes. And he had them framed and put in his office. And as he moved from as Attorney General into his role in the Senate, he took it with him. And so as he was, and then afterwards, as he was trying to process what he'd seen in Mississippi, as we'll talk, he wrote to Martin Luther King. And as you will know, if you look closely at the exhibit, they didn't work closely together. They were, as they mentioned, the author who was here a couple of weeks ago, David Margolek, said they were sort of climbing the same mountain from different sides. But there was a bit of a chasm between them. They had different methods, the two men, JFK and MLK, and they had two different approaches, different backgrounds, different experiences. But he wrote to him after he saw what he had seen in the Delta and said, I understand now what you're talking about, and I would be very interested to see if you have any suggestions and hear the suggestions you have about solutions. And then later that summer, as Marion Wright, who later became Marion Wright Edelman, was telling Kennedy as they were working to try to get some emergency food aid to the Delta, he said, bring the poor people to Washington. She said, I'm going to see Dr. King in Atlanta. I'm going through Atlanta. And he said, tell him, I said, bring the poor people to Washington. Bring the people to Washington so the nation and the leaders can see it. And when she told Dr. King, she said he was very kind of despondent. They'd been thinking about the Poor People's Campaign, but a lot of disagreement about how it should be done. And when she told him that Robert Kennedy sent him that message, she said it was like he treated her like she was an angel delivering a message. And they were there on the Mall after Robert Kennedy, both King and Kennedy were assassinated. The Poor People's Campaign and the place that they constructed, Resurrection City, were there as Kennedy's hearse came by, and the hearse slowed down and stopped just by the Lincoln Memorial. And the folks, many of them from Mississippi, from Marks, and some others had traveled on a mule train up to Washington, stood and sang Robert Kennedy's favorite hymn, which was the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And Robert Kennedy Jr. was 14 and a pallbearer, and he said that was the most indelible image, was all of those people standing there singing as his father's hearse went by. The other connection with Dallas, and then I'll sort of go back and talk a little bit about the book, is that two really important things. When I first started to write this book, I read about how it affected Kennedy, and I thought, how did his trip to Mississippi affect Kennedy? What was the impact on it? And the second thought I had was, what happened to the children he encountered? And I felt like that was an extremely important part of the story to tell it. So in a way, I sort of assigned myself homework for the next 10 years to try to find those children, because I always felt like I had it hanging over my head. But I followed the threads and the path and knocked on doors and talked to people in the Delta and called people and asked them questions and nosy questions. And the trail led me right here to the Dallas area. And we have one of those children of one of those families right here with us today. And I'm so proud. This is the first time we've met. Mr. Michael White is here. His mother was Annie White. And she's a very important part of the story, essential part of the story. And his brothers and sisters were also something that an important part of the story that I want to tell, and that moved Kennedy so much. And I didn't know did you have anything that you'd like to say, or? Yeah, good. Okay, but I'm so glad to meet him first. I'm just very, very excited that he's here. And so he lives in the Dallas area as well as his brother, who was the child that Kennedy was so moved by. Also, the second part of the story is the photographs by Dan Gurovich were some beautiful, compelling photographs that I was searching, was unattributed. This one in the Kennedy Library was unattributed. And I wanted to attribute it. I thought I wanted to use it for something on the cover. And so I searched, and to make a long story short, I found the photographer, the heirs of the photographer, David and Melinda Gurovich. And Melinda was nice enough to go into the closet and look to see if there were any more photos, and found a beautiful cache of photographs that told the story in such a compelling way, including this cover photograph that had never been published before, and several others. So, and she lives here in Dallas. They live here in the Dallas area. So there's so many connections here in Dallas, and that makes it extra special for me to be here. But that said, let me tell you a little bit about the book. And so, because I'm living in Oxford, Mississippi now, I think it's requirement, maybe in my contract, that I have to quote William Faulkner first off. But I read there are two quotes. The one that I included in the book is, to understand the world, you first have to understand a place like Mississippi. Another quote that I found later on, because people say, how did you get started on this book? And Faulkner said that for him, a story usually started, a good story, with a single compelling image or memory. And for me, there was a compelling image that sort of started me on this journey to understand what happened to Robert Kennedy on his journey into the Delta. And that was a scene described in all of Robert Kennedy's biographies as a pivotal moment, and also in my colleague Curtis Wilkie, who's former Boston Globe reporter. And he had a story in his memoir about Robert Kennedy. When he was a young reporter, Robert Kennedy came to the Delta, and he went into this home in Cleveland, Mississippi, a very poor home, and one of the poorest in the poorest part of the city. And Kennedy was always drawn to children. He had 10 at that time, eventually 11 of his own. He, in many ways, was much more comfortable with children than he was with adults. And so he was 7 of 9 children, and he had a connection. And so as some of the senators were talking to others, to the Mrs. White, he got down on the floor with the baby that was there, a child, as Curtis described, and kept trying to coax a response out of it. And the child was so focused, he didn't care about this white man in a fancy suit. Senators, doesn't matter about that. He was trying to get every little crumb of cornbread and beans and rice off the floor. And Kennedy could tell by looking at the child's body that he was not getting the nutrients that he deserved and that he needed. He was not growing the way he should. And Kennedy tried for 5 or 6 minutes to get a response out of this child who was very listless, and he was deeply moved by that moment. And I was so struck by this description of this son of American power and privilege and hope and all of the things that the Kennedys kind of had represented in American culture. And I had been a reporter in North Mississippi. I'd been in some of those places, even if it was years later. I knew what they were like, and I was really intrigued by the juxtaposition of him in this dark place. And but the second question, as I said, so I wanted to know what the impact it was, and I read where Kennedy had told one of his aide's wives, when he got back, he said, "You don't know what I've seen. You don't know what I've just seen. Everything I've done has been worthless." And I thought, wow, that is a really, was that an overreaction? It almost seemed like an overreaction. It seemed like, because he wasn't a really emotional kind of guy in a lot of ways. And so I wanted to find that, and I wanted to find the child. But it's important to kind of understand where Kennedy was at that time and what was going on in America. He had finished his term as Attorney General, consumed by grief after the loss of his brother for a while, helped to get the Civil Rights Act passed, and then right after that, he resigned as President Johnson's Attorney General, and he ran for Senate from New York and won, and was representing, starting in 65, ran in 64, and was representing New York. And as that, he started having a growing interest in poverty. He represented some very poor parts of New York, inner city parts, including the Bedford-Stuyvesant area. And he had worked with the other senators, Senator Javits, liberal Republican from New York, and they had worked on this public-private partnership that was very innovative for the time, where they brought private enterprise and government work, and charities and philanthropic efforts into to kind of have an enterprise zone and to development this area of New York City and Bedford-Stuyvesant. And it had kind of grown out of his work as Attorney General with a study that he'd commissioned on juvenile delinquency. So he was more and more interested in this. And so he's serving on, assigned to a committee, the Senate Subcommittee for Employment, Manpower, and Poverty. And the War on Poverty was about 2 years old. And some of those things were coming up for reauthorization. They were having hearings on it to see how effective they were. And so there was a whole couple of days of hearings in Washington in March of 1967. And Marion Wright, there's a photograph as it goes through. Marion Wright was a young NAACP lawyer. She's only 27 years old, young African-American woman. Just looks impossibly young and impossibly earnest and but she was so just confident in herself and grounded in what she believed was right. She was one of 5 African-American attorneys in the entire state of 2 million people. The only woman, first African-American woman to pass the Mississippi bar. And she said that she'd been there about 3 years by the time she got to Washington. And she said there was never a time in Mississippi that she didn't get in her car and hold her breath until it turned over, because she expected a bomb to blow up while she was there. And the judges no one would shake her hand, the other attorneys wouldn't shake her hand. But as one of the reporters I interviewed said, then she would get in the courtroom and run circles around them legally and argue. So she represented groups that were desegregating schools. She also represented Head Start, which was one of these war on poverty programs, and it was under attack. Senator Stennis, who was the U.S. Senator from Mississippi at the time, had waited 8 days from the time Head Start got the grant before he started investigating them and started, having them followed and having their, trying to get them audited and critiquing everything that was done in these early childhood. So she was there to defend Head Start, but she went off topic. She said, she did her job defending Head Start, but she said people in the Delta are worse off than they were before this. There's an unfolding catastrophe, and no one's doing anything about it, and someone needs to do something about it, and you need to do something about it. And she looked straight at them. She has a very deep, powerful, rich voice, and she was very emphatic that people don't know how they're going to feed their children. They don't know how they're going to get through the winter. People are begging. And so they decided to have their first hearing. They were going to have hearings decided to have it in Mississippi. And so that's how they got to Mississippi. Now, arriving in Mississippi, it was kind of a catalyst that brought out the extremes of Mississippi culture, because at one end, he was there for about 48 hours. He arrives and protesters meet him at the airport that are associated with the Klan. They're not dressed out, but they were part of the Klan according to the law enforcement sources. And they're protesting his visit and handing out leaflets predicting his death. And by the time he leaves Clarksdale, a little more than 48 hours later, he's on a car with more than 1,000 people, mostly African American, just trying to touch him, just reaching up to touch him, and where he can just talk for a few minutes. And in the meantime, he met with civil rights advocates. He met with the city's he had dinner with in this lovely suburban home with the city's liberal and moderate kind of elite. He took a nap in the bedroom of a Jackson pediatrician, because the pediatrician thought he looked tired that afternoon and said, "Would you like to come home and take a nap?" And he said, "You know what, I'd like that." So they slipped out the back. He sat by the hotel and drank with a reporter and talked about New York politics and baseball. He gave 2 impromptu speeches, one at Tougaloo, which is predominantly African American college there in Jackson that had been active in the civil rights movement. The other one was Millsaps, which was a predominantly white institution, Methodist school college there in Jackson, to extremely enthusiastic crowds of young people, black and white. And the next morning he flew to the Delta. And now things were changing there in the Delta. The Civil Rights Act had been passed. The Voting Rights Act had been passed. But those impacts were just starting to make their way down. And there was also an economic disruption, is the word we like to use today. But within about, one of the numbers that stunned me was that within about an 18-month period, 25,000 Mississippians had lost their livelihoods from mechanization, a combination of mechanization, pre-emergent herbicide, set-aside programs and subsidies, and the farm workers' minimum wage. And another 25,000 elderly and young people and spouses who worked some during the season had also lost that livelihood, and many of them had lost their place to live because where they lived was tied to their work on the plantations and the farm, as mostly day laborers by that time. But you had that's the population of a small city of people, and no one was doing anything about it. They couldn't get day work to be paid, and they had done away with the commodity system and changed it to food stamps, which you had to buy. So they couldn't get money anymore, and they couldn't get the free commodities anymore. They had to buy food stamps. So they were they were actually worse off than they had been 10 years before. So there were other forces at work, interesting, in the same week. The day before he arrived in Greenville, he flew from Jackson to Greenville, many of the ladies in Greenville had hosted a luncheon for Maureen Reagan, the daughter of the charismatic California governor at the time, and she was looking for votes for Phyllis Schlafly as leader of I think it was like the Conservative Republican Federation of Women. She had been there the day before, which hosted by Clark Reed, who wanted to build a Republican alternative to the dominant Southern Democrats who dominated the Southern South. The day Kennedy left Jackson that night, Stokely Carmichael, who was the one who had coined the term Black Power, spoke in Tougaloo, right where Kennedy had spoken the night before, and had a lot to say about the Kennedy administration's slow response to civil rights and their failures as in the Department of Justice. And he had a pretty scathing critique of some of the things that Kennedy had done at the time, or not done. So I tried to tell this story to let people know. I felt like looking at this short time period that he was, would help us kind of understand what he saw that made him say, everything I've done in my life has been worthless. What I've done has been worthless. And it was Marion Wright who rode with him and who told him a story and drew a very clear line between some of the political accommodations and the political calculations he had made for protecting his brother and his attorney general, and as they were coming into office with a very narrow margin of victory, without a real sense of the true pain of African Americans in the South and what Jim Crow was actually like. So she drew a very clear line between that civil rights, some of the failures there on progress in civil rights, and the hungry children that he was seeing that day. And you can see as the photos go by. But as I was researching this, I realized that in all the books and all the stories, the people that he encountered had been sort of faceless, nameless, kind of props in a morality play. They were the poverty backdrop, the poverty set for, as sort of this great man of history to come in, which makes sense if you're writing a biography just of Robert Kennedy, but that's not the story I wanted to tell. That's one of the reasons I wanted to tell the story of the women and children. Because the important thing about Kennedy that was very interesting to me is that he listened to women and children at a time when a lot of men, especially in power, were not trained to weigh those emotional kinds of calculations. They're much more likely to talk about policy. And the experience that he had as he went into some of these homes was one that took him from an abstract idea of poverty or policy, administrative issues and questions and statistics, to the concrete reality of a tiny child scrapping for pieces of rice off a floor. And he could never shake those images. Those images, they never left him. He was talking about it 5 minutes before he died. Pundits, as he ran for president, said, why does he keep talking about Mississippi and Indiana? That's not going to win him any votes. Why does he talk about poverty? And so, of course, Vietnam was a huge part of why he ran for president. But by interviewing some of Kennedy's friends, his aides, his family members, and reading the coverage, I really believe that part of the urgency, the reason he didn't run in 72 and he ran in 68 was he couldn't get what he wanted done. He ran into so many obstacles in Washington. He couldn't help these children fast enough. And so he felt like, he told one of the doctors who had visited the Delta, he said, I'm just one of 100 after they'd had this difficult hearing in July after he went in April and got nowhere on emergency funding. It took a full year to get emergency food aid to the Delta after Kennedy went there. He said, I'm just one of 100 here. Sometimes, and he pointed to the White House, he said, sometimes you have to be in that building to get anything done. So that was kind of that's kind of an overview of what was going on, and I really wanted to bring the stories of those women and those children and name them. Miss Annie White, Michael's mom, and Miss Fannie Dillard, and Edna Luckett. I always like to say their names because so many of the reporters, I tracked down every report, local, national, of this trip, and so many of the people just said Kennedy talked with a Negro woman or a Negro child, and didn't give them their names. So it really was very important for me to tell their names and tell their stories, because what happened in those cabins was before he came and after he came was as important to understanding the Delta as looking at the policy that he worked on after he left. Miss or Adele Wilson is the other name I always like to say. Okay, so I wanted to read just a little portion about what Kennedy saw when he came to Cleveland, Mississippi. This is from a young man, Charlie Dillard, who was 9 years old when Kennedy came, and one of the first of the children that I found. And he remembered it very clearly, but you have to understand, for these folks, it was just one day, Man came, they talked about it, but it's not a fairy tale. It's not like some magic wizard came in and changed everything in their lives. There were some things that gradually got better, some policies that started to affect it. Some of the local people were embarrassed by how bad that part of town was, so they paved the streets, and they started putting in water. They knocked down some of the worst houses and got them into other houses. But this is part of Charlie Dillard's story, and it's drawn from his memories. And then also I watched some of the outtake footage that I tracked down of Kennedy's visit and some of his interactions here. So I'm just going to read a little bit of it, and then we'll have questions. You have a card on your seat where you can write the questions, and Lindsay here is going to collect them, and then we can talk about them. So 9-year-old Charlie Dillard's life was filled with uncertainties. his grandfather's unpredictable temper, his mother's frequent and often frantic search for work, just to name two. However, some things were certain. His grandparents' three-room home in Cleveland, Mississippi, which he shared with his 8 brothers and sisters, as well as various aunts, uncles, and cousins, would be cold in the winter. It would be sweltering in the summer heat, and there would be nights that he would go to bed hungry, even days in a row when he would have almost nothing to eat. There would be times when, with his growing legs aching, his stomach hollow and gnawing, he would lie awake and weep. At the time of Kennedy's visit, Charlie lived on Christmas Avenue in the low end of the East Side, a poor black neighborhood a few blocks from the center of the former railroad town. The rail line that ran through the heart of town had shaped both Cleveland's history and the racial landscape of the city, acting as a dividing line between mostly all-white upper and middle-class homes and the East Side, where closely packed, weather-beaten, often crumbling shacks housed much of the city's African-American population. Charlie's grandfather, Joseph Dillard, had grown weary of always owning the landowner, and in 1960 he gave up sharecropping and moved his family to Cleveland, where he found work at the county road barn. His daughter, Pearlie Mae, had stayed in the country with her own growing family to work in the fields. Chopping and picking cotton was all Pearlie Mae Dillard knew. Because her parents needed the help of all their children in the fields, she had rarely ever gone to school. Starting late after the cotton picking season and leaving in the spring for planting and weeding meant that she was always behind. Overwhelmed and struggling, she gave up attending school. Then the babies started coming. First Rob, and then Charlie and his twin brother Charles, and then 6 others, all delivered by midwives in tenant shacks deep in the rural Delta, far from medical care. One of the babies died from pneumonia after only a few months, as his mother watched, helpless to save him. As the 1960s unfolded, waves of change began to sweep over the Delta. The fieldwork grew scarce and unpredictable, and Pearlie Mae, who remained a single mother, struggled to care for her children. Charlie never knew his father, and his mother moved him and his brothers and sisters often. Until a short time before Kennedy visited, they landed at her father's house in Cleveland. Pearlie Mae had heard that there was work in Florida in the vegetable fields for more money than she could make in Mississippi, and she had headed down there to find out. The addition of 8 hungry children to his household weighed heavily on Joseph Dillard. He already had a few of his youngest of his 9 children with him, and some of them had babies of their own. By April of '67, there were 15 people living in the small house, and his county wages were hardly sufficient to feed, clothe, and care for all of them. Angry over Pearlie Mae's departure, Joseph Dillard was often harsh with her children. His wife, Fanny, however, always insisted that they take their grandchildren in and love them all in her quiet way. A deeply religious woman, she had often given up her own meals for them. At times, Joseph would order her not to feed Charlie and his brothers and sisters if the food got scarce. However, if his grandmother had something, she would share it with the children when her husband left the house. When the family did eat, it was usually a meager meal of molasses and bread or cornbread and beans, supplemented with vegetables from the garden during the summer. Occasionally, they might have salmon croquettes, but they almost never had meat. Sometimes their neighbors in the close-knit East Side community, poor as they were themselves, sent whatever leftovers they had to help Fanny Dillard feed the children. With no money for toys, Charlie and the other children spent most of their time playing in the grassless yard outside their grandparents' home. He was playing there that April afternoon when he looked up and saw the newsmen aiming their big black cameras at a man in a suit coming towards his house. Kennedy, escorted by Amzie Moore, a local civil rights stalwart, was walking the unpaved streets of the East Side. To Charlie's surprise, Kennedy approached the Dillard home, but stopped to talk with the children before going inside. Kennedy greeted Charlie, delighting him by shaking his hand, a shocking thing for a white man to do in 1967 in Mississippi. Kennedy asked Charlie about school, which he was not yet attending, and then asked him what he had eaten that day. Molasses, Charlie answered simply but truthfully. As Kennedy talked with the other children, Charlie ran inside the shack to tell his grandmother about the visitors, and Kennedy followed, climbing over the unpainted steps to the screened-in porch. Charlie watched from the corner behind his grandmother. "How do you feed all these children?" Kennedy, who was the father of 10 children at the time, asked. "It was hard, but they got by," Fanny Dillard told him. Opening the door to the screen-in porch, Kennedy greeted Fanny Dillard quietly, almost shyly. Dillard, a sturdy woman with expressive eyes, had her hair tied up in a ragged scarf and wore a worn house dress. The senator asked her about her family's meals that day. "No, didn't have no meat, sir," she was quick to answer. "Then what did they have to eat?" Kennedy wanted to know. "Bread and syrup," Fanny Dillard replied. Kennedy struggled to understand her Mississippi accent. "Bread and what?" he said. "S-Y-R-U-P, S-Y-R-U-P, she said, her voice rising. "Syrup and bread?" Kennedy repeated slowly. "Well, what, did they have any lunch?" he asked. "No, I ain't giving them no lunch," Charlie's grandmother said, frowning and glancing down. Then looking up again to meet Kennedy's gaze, she added, "I won't feed them again until the evening." But they, Kennedy stammered. "I can't hardly feed them but twice a day," she said, raising her voice a little as she talked over his objections. Silenced, Kennedy blinked, then his eyes widened momentarily in surprise. He looked over her shoulder to Charlie, who stood leaning on the rail in the corner of the porch, his head resting on his thin arms. Kennedy's gaze shifted then towards the yard where the other children from Cleveland's east side milled around the newsmen. He nodded to Mrs. Dillard and looked down. With a rueful sigh, Kennedy turned to go. Charlie's grandmother stood still on the porch, her left hand on her hip. She stared into the middle distance, biting her lip as he walked out. So there. Do we have any questions? Okay. Oh, good question. Can you tell us about how life in the Delta has or hasn't changed in 50 years? That's a really good question because the last part of my book, because I tracked down these folks who were children at that time, I talk about their lives now and some of what's going on, and use it to talk about what's going on in the Delta. And I want to thread the needle on this very carefully because the Delta still has a tremendous problem with poverty. There's still very poor people there, still hungry people there, and you can see some of the numbers about the food insecurity, some of the highest, what they call hunger now, highest food insecurity in the nation in the 2nd Congressional District, which covers most of the Delta, which is about an 18-county region in the Northwest. But compared to 1967, some things are better because there was very little safety net at that time. Counties could opt out of school lunches, and the 3 counties that he visited did, or the school districts could, and so many of these children didn't get free lunches. Even though the free lunch program was in place in America and other places, the counties had chosen not to do it. Mr. White's sister, Edna, she told me about her teacher who would always every week bought an extra lunch ticket with her own money and would give it to one child who didn't get to eat. And so there were about 5 or 6 of them, and they would rotate. And she said the week that she got to eat, I mean, even 50 years later, her face just lit up because she would get a hot meal in the middle of the day. So children now do get free or reduced price lunches. After Kennedy came, there was a big push, a focus towards hunger, and it shifted the conversation from poverty for a little while towards hunger. And poverty is kind of an abstract thing. It's a sliding scale. We would all probably draw a slightly different picture of it if we had to draw a picture. But everybody, even people who are well off and have always been, know what it's like to feel hungry at some time and could feel that and identify with that. And so things like the WIC program came into being after that, which is aid for women and infants and children. And the food stamp program, it took 10 years from the time Kennedy was there, but they did eliminate the purchase requirement for a while. So there is more of a safety net than there was then, but it's fraying and it's almost always under attack. So there are certainly children, and you also have children now because, and I didn't really realize this till I wrote about it, there's a connection to food insecurity and obesity. Because if especially in children, young children, if you don't get regular meals, your body holds on to what you get when you get it. And so you have children, and also it's a lack of access to good food. A lot of them, it's a rural area. One of the women who's in her late 60s, who was a teenager when Kennedy came, she lives about 10 miles from the grocery store. She doesn't have a car. She has to pay part of her food stamps to somebody. She has to trade them or pay somebody with her little bit of Social Security to take her to the grocery store. And she does run out of food sometimes several each month, her nephew told me. So there, I just don't want it to seem like we've spent all this money and it hasn't helped, because there are a lot of people who were helped and are helped by some of the safety nets, but it's under attack and it's always fraying. Does that sort of answer your questions? Okay, high school teachers with a lack of time rarely discuss Bobby beyond Attorney General and his assassination. What is one story that you recommend to expand his narrative for today's students? The trip to Mississippi. No, my book. No, I do think. I do think that there is some more attention to his work on poverty, and one of the things that he did was, because where he went, the press went. But it was different from today's poverty, what we consider a poverty tour, which is nothing wrong with it, but you have a celebrity who goes in and uses the cameras that follow them to call attention to a problem. He was actually there as a fact-finding mission. And in fact, one of the reporters called him with the air of an inspector general, because he didn't want to just go where advocates wanted him to go. He made unscheduled stops. He didn't just want to see what the people were leading him around to see. He was a prosecutor, a lawyer. He was really made an effort. He asked reporters, why did they, who could he trust? Like, he pulled one of the longtime Mississippi reporters aside and says, which one of these people in Mississippi these advocates and civil rights activists, who can I trust? Who's going to tell me the truth? So he went in with an open mind, but also a level of healthy skepticism too. There are several things that have looked at, some magazine articles and other things that just looked at Kennedy with poverty, because once he saw it in Mississippi, he started seeing it elsewhere, and he started going off the official itinerary everywhere. So when he went to Appalachia, he would go to these make unscheduled stops. And he actually asked, the reason we don't have any pictures inside Miss Annie White's home is that he asked, after the first photographs were taken, he asked the cameras not to go in because he felt like it was disrespectful. And so he wasn't just there as part of, his posturing on that. So I think, if you can find anything about some of his visits to the Indian reservations, he went he had a deep connection with Cesar Chavez and some of the workers in California, the field workers. Any of those, I think, can help expand on that theme. So did any of Kennedy's family continue his interest in the Delta? Well, I do think they all, they remembered, the oldest children remembered him coming in the night of his visit to the Delta, just shaken. And I was lucky enough to get to interview his oldest daughter, Kathleen, and Robert Kennedy Jr., and then Mrs. Kennedy. And it was a memory that they all, because it was so different, and he was so upset by what he had seen in Mississippi. And he comes in, they were having a birthday dinner for her. She let them stay up late. So he flew from seeing Charlie and the Whites and some other families. He flew to Washington and came into his house like a few hours later, and there are all of his healthy children, well-fed, in this beautiful, fancy dining room, and he just stops on the threshold and starts to talk to them. He said, I've just been in homes where people live in whole houses the size of this room, and they don't have enough to eat, and you can see it on their bodies, and you must do something for your country. And that was a really different way that he usually came in, they said. They do, I think so to answer the question, they're all interested. The ones that I've been in touch with remember that as an important event in their father's life, and Kathleen Kennedy had written about it. They haven't been particularly active in doing anything in the Delta, although they did come down, and I took them to two of his grandchildren came down in May and went to Mark's for the 50th anniversary. And they told his granddaughter, Kik Kennedy, Robert Kennedy's granddaughter, said that that we had a little, I got together some of the people from my book who had met their grandfather, and we had some barbecue together. And she said, I know if he touched you in any way, you need to know that you touched him much more deeply, in a much deeper way. So I feel like that they're going to be maybe more interest from the Kennedy family in the Delta. This is a question that said, I volunteered in the Clarksdale area about a decade ago with my church and Habitat for Humanity. Is Habitat still active in that area today? Is it making a difference? I don't know the answer to that question. I really don't. I would hope so. I would like to think so. I remember. I haven't seen much about it lately, but there's sort of been the collapse of regional news reporting too, so I might have missed it. But I don't really know. Not where I was. I didn't see much evidence of Habitat. Okay. RFK, who I deeply admire, was known to have displayed his privilege from excluding LBJ and others at Hickory Hill to never carrying money on the campaign trail in 1968. Did his experience in 68 impact his view of his own privilege and how he behaved? That's a really good question, because he was just oddly childlike about money from what people said. And there was a kind of a funny story where they were at a church and they were passing the offering plate, and he said to one of his aides, would you put something in there for me? And he put it in, and he put a $20 bill in, and Kennedy looked at him and said, don't you think I ought to be more generous? But that's a really good question. Like, how did he respond personally? And I did interview because you would think if you'd seen so much of this and you were a wealthy person, you would want to, give away some of your own wealth or use something. I talked to a woman who was an intern in his office who saw him come back that morning with and pull out little pieces of paper from all his pockets and spread them out. And there were names and addresses. And he started calling and saying, could you send a carton of soup here? Could you send a box of shoes there? And calling foundations and charities and giving these addresses to people that he knew who did these kinds of things. I don't know that he ever quite. I think he was very conscious of that. What he had was, that he was very compared to what a lot of people had. He was very privileged. Was he conscious of how he wore that? Now, he was not a saint, and one of his big there were several weak spots, but one of his big weak spots is just how much he detested Lyndon Johnson. And the two of them, if they could have put aside their mutual animosity and worked together on something they both cared about, which was poverty, they could have achieved a lot more. But he could not get past how much he disliked him. Johnson did not trust him didn't think that he was sincere about going to the Delta, thought it was a stunt to make him look bad. And in the beginning it might have been, but I think it was pretty clear from everybody I talked to that he was legitimately moved and stunned and changed by what he saw there. But he couldn't, and he did always think sort of in a kind of political strategy. So one of the reasons that civil rights and poverty was something that he did include, one of his speechwriters told me, was that Eugene McCarthy, who was his big rival in the primary, didn't have any interest in poverty, didn't have any plans or care too much about it. And because he'd come out early against the war, McCarthy, he had so much support of the younger voters who resented Kennedy coming in late and as an opportunist. And so he felt like by talking about civil rights and some poverty issues and social justice that might peel some of McCarthy's voters off too. So he wasn't like this pure person who never thought a political thought. He did look at it in that way. But he also did say quite often, McCarthy does not care about the poor, and I feel like I need to do something now because if he wins, and he didn't think Nixon did either. So that was he just didn't think that was going to be an issue unless he continued to talk about it. So, anything else? Okay.
Before we give a huge round of applause to Ellen Meacham, I have several questions. First
Sure.
of all, well, thank you very much for bringing people who are featured in these amazing photographs here. What a lovely connection. And also I want to thank Melinda Gurovich for her father-in-law for these wealth of historic photographs that were hidden away, so we still can find these amazing collections that people don't think are important, that really shed light on an amazing piece of history. And we are visual people, and since we seem to be dissing words and fake news,
Right.
These images are so incredibly powerful. And I want to ask you,
Yes.
what words of wisdom do you have to these new scholarship students here as they are deciding what angle of the news that they would like to pursue? And since you are a professor of journalism, so I'm going to step away.
That's great. Well, you're not supposed to be biased as a reporter, but I think that being a reporter is the best job in the whole world. So that is one thing. I don't know of another job where you can learn something new every day, meet new people every day, hear their stories. It's a great intellectual challenge to take something complicated and try to make it simple, but still be accurate. That's a great kind of puzzle to get your head around. And you have a chance to make a difference or do good. And you're participating in a very important link in the democracy. So I would just encourage you to look for stories, tell them, get out of the office, talk to people. Don't be afraid to knock on doors. That's what I was lucky that I started my career before there were cell phones. At the very beginning of my career, we had computers, but we didn't have the internet or cell phones. And so you could call somebody on the phone, but you pretty much had to go out there to find the information. You couldn't just see the police report on the website. You had to go to the police station and talk to the police officers. You had to go out to the schools and talk to the teachers. Or the principals or the children. And so get past the official story. Get the official story, but get past it to the human stories. Because as humans, we understand our world through narrative and through story and connect to other humans. And I think we're kind of seeing that now. Everybody, there's so much talk about what's going on at the border. And I think as humans, we are wired to respond to the cues from children that need help. I think that's part of what Kennedy saw, because he had 11 children of his own. He knew what child development was like. He knew where they ought to be. He knew what healthy children, how they acted and what they looked like, and how they interacted. And the other thing is that I think that he has a lesson for us, and I guess for journalists too. I was quite struck in his rhetoric compared to today, in that he focused on, he almost never labeled or called anybody name. Even the people that he opposed, he left room for his opponents to change their mind and still save a little face. And so he talked about ideas and what's right, not who's right. And so when Senator Stennis, who had been an opponent of Head Start, was a staunch segregationist, after the second hearing where they had showed these really dramatic moments where they showed some of these photographs, and I'm not sure if they weren't some of the Gurovich photographs, because I just read the transcript, but Kennedy is holding up photographs. Do you see these children? Do you see, don't you see these were taken in Mississippi? And Senator Stennis leans in and says, I just want to go on record that I have always been against hunger and malnutrition, disease and malnutrition. And he kind of dryly says, well, okay, we've got you on record for that, Senator. But then a couple of weeks later, he calls and offers $10 million in emergency aid in an amendment. And Peter Edelman, who's Kennedy's, like fire-breathing aide on social justice issues, says, this is an insult. This is ridiculous. It's a pittance. It's too late. Look, we're not going to take this money. And Kennedy said, no, we are going to take this money. We are going to say thank you. We are going to build on it, and we're going to include him. And we're not going to, blast him in the press. We're going to take the money and go from there. I think as reporters, if you can try to get past, I think you'll be helping democracy if you can try to talk about ideas, not people, and what's right, not who's right, and focus in on those kinds of discussions and not get distracted by the others. I guess that's my best advice.